Chapter 14. A big brawny scaredy cat. Nick stayed at Grand's that night, having to take Katie into town in the morning. He had administrative and planning events that he needed to take care of with his agent and publicity team. His morning was completely taken up by his own things, so he dropped Katie at Sean and Kathy's to enjoy their company, until her appointment at Vanderbilt's Children's Hospital. Kathy and Katie enjoyed a nice lunch at the Everett's house. There were not many places that Katie could go and not be bothered by someone and their tragic stories. Ministering and visiting with children was the thing Katie looked forward to most of all. She so loved children, and special needs children were her specialty. She had the knack of being able to get into their hearts to get them to trust her and bond with her. They always sensed her as a safe person, because being a kindergarten teacher, most children remember their kindergarten year as their best. Thus, a kindergarten teacher garnered a certain respect from children of all ages. Even the most stubborn, rebellious teenagers would melt around the kindergarten teachers, and those were the ones Katie loved the best, having been an injured teen, as well as her Michael. Now, she had Nick's injured teen's heart to love. Although she loved to encourage the downtrodden, it was at her book signings where she would shine, having prepared for them with lots of prayer. On the cuff, though, at a restaurant, having a tragic story told to her, would sometimes catch her off guard, and cry with the suffering was all she could do. There were many times when that was all the person wanted. The only problem with this was that the grieving person who had coped with the tragedy had all that time to process their suffering, while the story was fresh and new to Katie. Not only did she not like living in a glass house, but her heart was so sensitive that when she was upset or stressed, eating was distasteful to her, and before Scotty and Nick came around to watch her every move, she just chose not to eat. This was not an option anymore, as there was always someone with her at mealtimes and she was forced to eat, whether she was hungry or not, thus getting in her 3 square meals every day and growing a bit more round with each passing week. At Vanderbilt, Nick brought his guitar and sang to the children, signing autographs and giving away free CDs. Katie signed books, giving them away to the parents and the staff. They were an absolute hit at the hospital, and the president of Vanderbilt University made them promise to return, yearly if not semi-yearly. All the children adored both of them. As Katie watched Nick sing and interact with the children, she began to respect and admire him more and more, not only for his talent with song, but also his talent with children's tender hearts. It seemed that he was also able to reach inside their sweet vulnerable souls, and they felt safe around this big brawny brute, as Katie would call him in front of the children. She made her typical tortoise-brain jokes about Nick, and he happily played along, creating a humor-filled day. It was on their way out of the hospital that Katie showed her true gift with the hurting soul of a child. They had passed a treatment room, in which they could hear the child screaming from as far away as inside the stairwell. As they walked by, Katie poked her head in the doorway. She saw a young child kicking and screaming while nurses and doctors tried to convince the child to sit still for a new 4 to be placed. This child had been battling cancer for such a long time, having been poked, prodded, pinched, and stabbed with endless needles. He finally broke. He was not going to have any more needles put in him, and he was determined to win that battle. As Katie poked her head around the corner, one of the nurses spotted her. She looked toward the doorway and the beleaguered mother. With tears in her eyes, the distressed mother welcomed Katie into the treatment room. Katie signaled for Nick to enter the room, and the mother got a good long hug from Katie, with a few words of encouragement. It was the child's turn to feel the love and sensitivity of the kindergarten teacher and receive the bravado of a big, brawny, scaredy cat. Katie got down on her knees and approached the crying boy. She took a couple of tissues from the hospital tissue box. She dabbed the tears on his cheek and under his eyes with the most compassionate, loving look in her eyes. She then handed a tissue to the little boy. "Do you know how to blow your own nose?" The little boy nodded. "Okay, so can you make an elephant sound when you blow your nose?" The little boy giggled and shook his head. "Do you want to learn how to do that?" Everyone in the room laughed. "Are you going to teach me?" Katie looked around the room at the doctors, nurses, attendants, and Nick. "I will, if all these people in this room promise to keep it a secret," or everywhere I go, I'll be forced to do it, and then eventually blood vessels in my head will blow and blood will squirt out everywhere all over the people." They all laughed and nodded. The little boy laughed heartily. "I won't tell anyone, miss. My name is Miss Kate." "So, tell me what's your name?" The little boy sniffed. "My name is Michael." Katie sucked in a deep breath and eyed Nick, who looked on and smiled. Most of the people there understood that name to mean much to Katie. "Well, that's my favorite boy's name, did you know that?" The little boy shook his head. "Well, okay, Michael," she was interrupted by the boy. "My family calls me Mikey, you can call me that." Katie grinned. "Okay, Mikey, so here's how you blow your nose and make an elephant sound. First you tighten your lips, like this." The boy imitated Katie. "Then you have to remember, you are going to blow as hard as you can and send all the air through your nose, but let just a little through your lips, the tiniest amount. Now, I'm going to show you, using my arm, because I don't have anything to blow in my nose, nor do I want snot and spit all over my sleeve," she said with a giggle. Katie proceeded to lift her upper arm to her mouth and, using the rest of her arm as a trunk, she made the loudest elephant noise. The entire room laughed, along with the boy. Katie looked around to make sure no one else saw her. She looked up at Nick, who was cracking up at the time. She had an embarrassed smile on her face, and Nick thought it was great. "How did you learn that, Miss Kate?" "Sweet pea, I'm a kindergarten teacher. I have to learn things like that, and I practiced a lot." The little boy sniffled. "Now you try it, only hold the tissue near your nose and blow as hard as you can, but don't blow out any blood vessels, I don't want to get blood all over my nice blouse here. I just bought it." The little boy grinned. He put the tissue up to his nose, blew as hard as he could to get all the mucus out, and made what sounded like a baby elephant noise. The adults in the room applauded. The little boy laughed, while Katie wiped the rest of the contents of his nose with a clean tissue. The nurse handed a small jar of hand sanitizer to Katie, then she handed it to Mikey. "Now, that was great. You can practice like I did with your arm, but don't do it too much, or you'll have funny blood vessels in your head popping out, and you'll look scary. Only a couple of times a day, okay?" He nodded with an assured smile. "Good, when you have it down pat, you have your mama contact me, and I'll come and watch you do it, okay Mikey? Do you live near here?" "Not yet, but someday I will. Even if I live far away, I'll come and watch, okay?" He nodded and hugged her. "Now, why don't you tell me why you were pitching such a fit?" "They keep sticking needles in me," he said as he started to cry. Katie put her fingers up to his lips. "Now, no crying, we don't need any more snot, we've had our fill for the day, huh?" The people laughed, as did the boy. He shook his head and gained his composure. "Good, tell me, do you think they like doing that?" He shook his head. "Me neither. Let me tell you, I love working with children and I'll bet these fine people do too, but I bet anything this is the part of their job they hate the most." They all nodded and agreed verbally. "So, what should we do about that? I feel sorry for these people, having to do this, don't you?" The boy nodded. "Would you want to stick cute little boys like you with a needle all day?" He shook his head. "Me neither. I have an idea." "What?" "Well, you see this big brawny bully behind me?" The boy looked up at Nick, who chuckled. "I have a secret to tell you about him, but like my elephant thing, you can't tell anyone, okay?" "I promise." "Scout's honor?" she said, holding up 2 fingers. "Scout's honor," he said, holding up his 2 fingers. Katie turned around and sought permission. "May I, Mr. Thomas?" He nodded, having no idea what she was going to say. "Thanks," she said, winking at him. "Well, this big, huge brawny, bebopper of country music, who can take anyone who tries to beat him up and will even take out anyone who tries to hurt me, is scared to death of needles. When he sees one, he almost throws up, can you believe that? Show me a needle, please." The nurse handed the catheter to Katie. She held it up to the little boy. I can't let him see it, but compare this tiny thing with that big, huge arm, and can you believe that? The boy shook his head. It's true, watch. Katie turned around and showed the needle to Nick, who feigned a frightened face and covered his mouth. She spun quickly back around and hid the needle. You see what I mean? The little boy nodded. Now, you don't look scared, or like you are going to throw up, you look brave to me. Look how small it is. I'm going to guess that this lady, who needs to put this in your arm, has had a lot of practice, and even went to school for it. The nurse nodded. That doctor there, let me tell you a secret, never let a doctor put one of these in. They are used to operating on a sleeping child, they have no clue how to do this. The doctors and nurses laughed. Always, ask for a nurse, they are so much better at it. Okay, I will. Good, now this is what I suggest. How about if you, me, and that jolly gorgeous giant sit next to each other, and all get stuck together? I've been meaning to donate some blood to this hospital, and he needs to also, 'cause he has talented blood. His blood will make some kid a great singer. Just a tube will do. I'm a writer, and a teacher, so whoever gets my blood will be a good writer and a teacher. What do you say? Katie looked at the nurses and doctors, and they nodded. You'll have to sign a waiver, Mrs. Moore and Mr. Thomas. No problem for me, how about you, big guy? He shook his head and looked scared. Oh, come on, you can't do this, but he can? Nick looked even more scared. Mr. Thomas, Mikey asked. I think you can do it, someone in this hospital needs to become a good singer, and they probably love music. Will you do it for them? Nick took in a deep breath. Only if you hold my other hand and squeeze it for me, he said. I can do that, Mikey said. Well, okay, let's get this show on the road. Katie said. No pun intended. Well, maybe intended a little, huh, Mrs. Moore? Nick asked. Geez, I wish people would stop stealing my lines, she blew out a raspberry. They all chuckled. Okay, now, Mr. Thomas, now there'll be no puking, because you know that's my fear, right? You're afraid of puking? Mikey asked. Oh, yes, when I see it, I puke. I'm like Superman. You know he has kryptonite, I have vomit. Nick laughed, remembering what melted her in the hospital. She turned her head and shot him a look. That'll be enough out of you, she said. It's true, I've seen it in action, stops her cold. It's what I use when she's giving me a hard time, I have a baggie full, I keep it in my freezer for when she is being mean to me, and I need to shut her down. They all laughed. Okay, that's enough. She dropped her head, chuckled, then whispered to Mikey. It's true, though, I melt whenever I see it, so please promise me you won't puke. I won't, Miss Kate. She looked back and chuckled at Nick, who did the best he could to not laugh. Okay, now, snot is my other thing I hate. I really need you to not cry, okay? Also, I'm a crybaby, and I cry when others do. That's true too. I've seen that in action too, those waterworks are just waiting for the next tender moment. She looked back at him. Enough already, why don't you just tell him what I weigh? 112, I think at last count. 118, and you, sir, have a terrible memory. They both laughed. Katie looked up at Mikey's mother and shrugged her shoulders. She giggled. Good. Nick said. Nag, Katie said, looking back at him. He tilted his head and raised an eyebrow. That's a talk for another day, now, can we just get this thing going? I want to see this big guy cringe, for picking on me. They all chuckled, and Mikey nodded. The attendants arranged the seating with the boy in the middle, he was holding Nick's hand as they called in extra measures of support. Excuse me, but doctor, will you do Nick's arm? Nick's eyes widened. Are you kidding me, Miss Kate? You just said never let a doctor do it, Nick said with fear. That's right. So, you are going to have to put on an extra measure of bravery. Do you think you can do that for Mikey, and not puke? Oh, Miss Kate, you don't play fair, he said winking. Oh no, this is payback for all those mean things you said about me a while back. The mother and the attendants all laughed, along with Nick. You see, Mr. Thomas said some mean things about me, that's why I called him a bully. But we are friends, now. However, when we do bad things, later on there could be consequences, and it seems that the only other person who can do this in this room is the doctor, so who do you think should get the doctor to stick his arm? Mr. Thomas, Mikey said. He looked at Nick, who had a look of resignation on his face. He took in a breath and let out a sigh of acceptance. I guess you're right, Miss Kate. I'll do it for you, and for Mikey. After that, no more payback, okay? Katie was silent. Okay? Again, she was silent, but giggled with Mikey. What do you think, Mikey? I think that is plenty of payback. I think you should forgive him and forget about it. Oh, I forgave him a long time ago, that is why we are friends, but you gotta have some harmless fun sometimes, huh? Harmless? Nick asked. Katie laughed and winked. Okay, I think we are all ready, huh, Mikey? The little boy nodded. The attendants lined up Nick and Katie and prepped all 3 arms. All at the same time, remember? They nodded. You ready, Mr. Thomas? He held his breath and took hold of Mikey's hand, feigned a nervous face, and nodded. Maybe, if you close your eyes, Mr. Thomas, it won't be as bad. Good idea, Miss Kate, Nick said. Mikey, how about you, you want to close your eyes? He nodded. Good, I'll close mine, and then we'll wait. All 3 clenched their jaws, pulled in their lips, and closed their eyes. No one made a sound. Except Katie when she got stuck. Ouch. What are you doing there? Did you use a chainsaw? Katie said, pulling back her arm. She opened her eyes and looked at the phlebotomist. Sorry, she said. I'm new at this, I'm kinda in training. Katie spit out a painful laugh. I'm ready, Nick said, as he braced himself when he heard Katie wince in pain. The needle is already in, Mr. Thomas, the doctor said. Surprise, I worked as a phlebotomist while going to medical school, I got pretty good at it, the doctor said. Katie and Nick laughed and so did Mikey. Mikey's eyes popped open, surprised at how little it hurt. Nah 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 nah, Nick said, sticking out his tongue at Katie, who was squeezing her arm. Sorry, Mrs. Moore, there could be a little bruising there, she said. Mikey laughed, and Katie shook her head while she giggled. Mikey did not flinch, while he paid more attention to the antics of Miss Katie and Mr. Thomas. Oh well, so much for payback, she said. Yep, and you promised Mikey they'd be no more after this. You know, Miss Kate, sometimes intentional and mean-spirited payback can backfire, remember, Ice Princess? Nick cracked up and Katie laughed, remembering the ice in the shower incident. The attendants in the room all looked puzzled. I got to witness Miss Kate getting some little payback of her own, once, and it was well-deserved. Katie chuckled. Oh well, I think this is another example of grace. Katie said. I know what that is, Mikey said. There, all done. The attendants took the tubes of blood, labeled them, and then taped the little boy's 4 to his arm. What is it, Mikey? Nick asked. It's getting something good that we don't deserve when we deserve something bad, because we did something bad. I learned about that in Sunday school. And that is correct, sweet Mikey. What a bright little boy you have here, Mrs. Hillsborough. I'm Emily Hillsborough, and it's Miss, she said with her head lowered. Well, then, Miss Hillsborough, God seems to have given this little boy as a gift of grace to you, huh? The mother nodded, understanding her point of the gift of Mikey. Katie winked and smiled at the single mother, then raised her eyebrows at Nick, reminding them of their guilt. Nick nodded with his lips tightened in regret. Both Mr. Thomas and I know a lot about God's grace, don't we, Mr. Thomas? We surely have gotten more than we deserve, he said. Humanity, who can understand it, except the one who created us, and the giver of all grace? Katie asked. They all nodded. Nick and Katie got their arms bandaged, and then hugged the little boy. Nick took a CD out of his bag, signed it, while Katie signed a book for Mikey's mom. Friends were made in that little treatment room, friends for life. Will you come back and visit me? Mikey asked. You just try and stop me, she said with a loving smile. I'll tell you what, if I'm here in Nashville, I will call and check to see if you are here, and I will. I live here, I'll check on you for both of us, okay? Nick said. You can come to my house, maybe for dinner sometime, right, Mom? Oh, honey, I'm sure Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Moore are very busy. I'm never too busy for a sweet little boy, and if your mom ever wants to have us for dinner, I'll leave my contact information with her. She can check my schedule on my website, and I'll come if she invites me, how's that? How about you, Mr. Thomas? If I'm in town, absolutely, he said. Great. Thank you, Miss Kate. Boy, I wish you were my kindergarten teacher. I'm in kindergarten, you know, he said. I wish so too. I don't teach kiddos anymore, but I want to go back to it, someday. I loved it. Right now, I'm teaching all kinds of people about Jesus and God's grace, just like you said. Oh, that's more important, huh, Mom? Mikey's mother nodded. That's for sure. She's a great teacher, too. I have one of these on my phone, but this is very special, thank you, Mrs. Moore. She held up the book. It's Katie, and you're welcome. Katie's eyes started to water. See what I mean, we better get out of here before she starts bawling, again. I'm all out of tissues in my bag, Nick said as he chuckled. She used them all up in the children's wing. They all laughed. Katie and Nick hugged the mom and the little boy and left the treatment room. As they walked down the hallway, Katie looked up at Nick as he looked down at her in wonder of her gift with children. He could not have felt more love and pride for her, he thought, than that day, but he's thought that every day. You're amazing, he said. No, just doing what I do best, like you do up on stage and in the recording studio. It's not that big of a deal. Oh, yes it is. That boy will never forget you. Yeah, nor you. I'm sure there's plenty of people every day who are singing your tunes, being inspired daily, the good ones that is. Nick shook his head, as they walked down the hallway toward the stairwell door. He stopped abruptly and grabbed her arm to spin her around to face him. She looked up at him taken aback. The good ones? She smiled and winked. Well, no one's perfect all the time. Do I need to ask which ones you think aren't the good ones? The ones that aren't Nicholas Paul songs. That's just because that's my taste. You know, I suppose you have to cater to the other side, if that is what sells, she said, and she continued down the hallway. He quickly caught up with her and stopped her again, spinning her around to face him, again, putting his hands on his hips. Did you just say what I thought you just said? What? That we artists have to do songs that aren't us because they sell records? Whatever happened to Love's Muses? Well, Mr. Thomas, as much as I believe in Love's Muses, there still are different strokes for different folks, and as long as they don't cross the line of decency, I suppose y'all need to make them happy too. She turned and again walked down the hallway. He joined her, catching up with her. Wow, this whole notoriety, traveling the country has really loosened you, huh, Miss Morality? This time it was Katie who stopped abruptly and grabbed his arm to stop him and forced him to face her. She put her hands on her hips. And was that a pot shot about sleeping with you and Scotty? Nick's shoulders dropped, realizing what he had just said. Oh, no, Teach, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry. Her consolation smile graced his contrite spirit. They both began a slow pace toward the stairwell door. I'm just a little more open-minded to different people's tastes, that's all. There were a few seconds of silence as they opened the door and entered the stairwell. So, do you ever take the elevator, or is it always the stairs? Are you secretly afraid of elevators, too? Well, to tell you the truth, keep this a secret, but not only do I like the exercise, but once when I was a little girl, someone threw up in an elevator that I was in, and we were going to the top floor. I just can't get that smell out of my nostrils every time I get in an elevator. They all smell like puke to me. Nick had to stop dead in his tracks because he was laughing so hard. Katie turned and laughed with him. Oh Teach, no one makes me laugh like you do. She shook her head and giggled, grabbing him by the arm, and pulled him down the stairs. And no one sets up my comedy routine like you do. Damn, you're a great moving target. Teach, your language. Oh, shut up, Matthew. He laughed, and she kept a straight face, shaking her head. He stopped and looked at her. Prude. He laughed, again. Chapter 15. Stupid is as stupid does 2.0. Nick and Katie